lot of you have been asking about what about regulation? What about ethics? And you're in luck because I had been preparing a presentation and a lot of thinking on exactly that. Now, some of you might be wondering, hey, I didn't know you know about this stuff, but turns out that I do because after doing my thesis on the net climate impact of AI and noticing that if we continue business as usual, perhaps we will have some major problems in terms of climate, I started taking quite a number of law classes. So I have been doing that. And I also reviewed this presentation with about 10 law professors, got their feedback and integrated it before sharing it with you. So hopefully it will be valuable for you. And just a caveat, this is not legal advice. But we're going to talk about an introduction. We're going to go over existing and potential laws. We're going to talk about some existing ethical frameworks and future potential ones and some ideas for the way forward. And I'm going to talk a bit more about why I think this topic is important. Starting with this, I have, some friends and family who have had babies, and what do I buy for them? I don't know. I was at the MIT shop looking for things, and here I picked up these books, AI for Babies, Climate for Babies. So far, I haven't gifted them to anyone because I'm not sure if I should, but this is a topic, right? This is like what is the world going to look like for people who are currently babies in terms of AI and climate, and how can we shape it? It's a real ethical conundrum, I think one of the biggest of our time, and something to think about as we're doing our projects and moving forward. So let's talk about it because these topics are important in exploring the intersection of AI and climate, and they're topics to think about when you're making your projects. So I want to frame ethical use of AI as core to effective climate action and not an afterthought, give some examples of unintended harms, and then also give some guiding questions for responsible AI deployment from a climate perspective. And really, after this session, like next week, we're going to have different workshops on the capstone project formats. So, from here on in, you're going to be doing homework too, but also working on your capstone. So these are things to think about when you think about what project do I want to make and how. So I wonder, what are some ethical dilemmas you've seen or thought about in AI and climate? Feel free to put those in the chat. I would love to hear about them. I want to talk about the importance of AI climate law, justice, and ethics now. So first, some of you may be familiar with this. Research from Stockholm Resilience Center says that unfortunately 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries have been crossed. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, not a climate scientist, but you can see some crazy ones here. CO2 concentration, that's carbon dioxide, is beyond this safe operating space. We also have fresh water, beyond and ocean acidification starting to go beyond the safe operating space. If you look at the link, you'll see that back in 2009, I believe, only 4 had been crossed. So this is certainly scary, and why looking at ethics is really important in terms of climate. And there's lots of bad impacts of climate change. So Climate Fresk goes into some of them. This is a really cool tool for those who haven't heard of it. Things like vectors of disease, terrestrial biodiversity issues, forest fires, river flooding, consequences like human health, hunger, armed conflicts, or climate refugees, which we're starting to see more of. This is a science-backed tool. And here's, when I was playing it, we got lots of sad faces and such. And then what are the causes? We've talked about some of them, but basically this human suffering here, that's the result of climate change, is caused by human activities like industry, agriculture, building usage, transportation, fossil fuels, and deforestation. All of this is leading to emissions of things like carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, which then go through a whole, climate cycle that leads to those bad impacts. Enter AI. We know that emissions continue to rise. 70% of emissions are energy and AI is very energy intensive. So we have a problem, you know? And last week we covered that, for example, in Ireland, data centers are 1/5 of the country's electricity and could grow to 1/3, which still boggles my mind. We went over, this is a bit of a review, some of the climate harms of AI. I've added land use as a key one as well, in addition to the emissions, air pollutions, noise, critical minerals, water use, hazardous waste. And this is just the climate harms. There's also societal harms, of course. And then we also talked about some of the AI solutions this week, like demand response, energy efficiency, policy, predictive maintenance, innovation, and so forth. So we had this question that we left with last week. If data centers grow to 21% of energy and AI can only mitigate 1.5 to 4% of emissions, AI will likely not reduce climate change. But how can we like adjust each of those numbers? What can we do? Because they're just predictions right now, but ultimately it'll be up to us, right? How can we fix that? And I think part of that is through this law and ethics side. It's also maybe through technology and, well, yeah, of course, partly through technology and other areas. So we have this ethical tension that AI could potentially help reduce climate change, but it's also a threat to the climate because it's so energy hungry. And here it is graphically illustrated. In sort of colloquial words, I'd say it's this. AI is awesome and can do so many cool things, but AI is also eating the climate, and we already have like so many climate issues. So what do we do, you know? And this is a, I did use AI to make a generative AI image, okay? And here's what it is, which is a pretty scary looking image of world versus AI. And so, some ways of addressing an ethical tension are to look at constraints, which we already looked at one, which was, hey, we've crossed some planetary boundaries here, which is a major issue. And we can also look at frameworks. So, that's what we're going to look at now. Here is a boundaries of tolerance framework from Harvard, from Jeffrey Saviano, an amazing person and researcher and entrepreneur. It's a pyramid of ethical progression. So you can think starting from the bottom, we have not complying with laws, okay? So this is, you know, not complying with AI laws, or you can think about a society or country like not complying with international or international law or its own laws or the even putting into place laws, right? And then we have reactive compliance, which is okay, there's laws, I did something wrong, now I better comply. Basic compliance is complying with laws, full stop. And then above it, we have moving towards more like now I'm complying with the laws and I'm doing additional ethical actions. Then there's proactive ethical integration. And then finally at the top, ethical stewardship. So being stewards of good ethics. So how can we move from must do to should do to could do and help others do the same? And so that's why when we're talking about ethics, we're talking not just about like ethics as a topic, but also laws and compliance and so forth. And so, just to drive this home, I think this topic matters because AI can help or harm, especially when applied at scale. A technology isn't necessarily inherently good or bad, it's how we design and use it. And climate action without ethics can reinforce inequality and cause harm. And there's significant equity concerns like who benefits, who's excluded or burdened, and who decides. And by the way, this is like I said, like a newer topic or presentation. So I'm very open to any feedback and things I can do to improve it. I'm going to be speaking in a university law class about this next week. So maybe I could even integrate it by then. Some examples of some ethical issues. So I think some of you have put some in the chat, and some that I came up with were smart grid programs that might, you know, raise the prices for some people or might cut off their energy, or AI models that might worsen inequality. There's also claims of green AI or greenwashing versus the actual carbon footprint. And then the countries that have contributed the least to climate change are often the most disproportionately harmed by it. And so, who benefits when AI for climate, in quotes, is deployed in vulnerable communities? And then here's like a really tangible example. Customers in certain states in the US ended up paying due to a regulatory gap $4.4 billion for data center transmission in 2024. So just to like, clarify, this is like, as far as I understand it, like end users paying on behalf of data centers, which is crazy. And so this was because of a regulatory gap, and the expenses for the upgrades were shared by the customers within a utility's footprint. So why do I, as a customer, or these folks, have to pay extra in energy costs for some data center, which maybe is irrelevant to what I'm doing? And once again, why are we talking about law? We're not lawyer like so I know we have some lawyers in the class, not all of us are lawyers, but I really want to highlight that there's opportunities for everyone to be involved. This is an example diagram of the process of lawmaking in Canada as an example. That's where I'm from. I've included a link to the US one, although it seems to be changing every day. Uh, but here's the Canadian one. I won't go into it in huge detail, but just to show that the process of lawmaking arguably starts off with the structure of society, things like ideologies, technology, and so forth, and then conflicts like humans and the environment and some, issues that we may notice, which leads to pressure for change, which all of us can be involved in, community organizing, political lobbying, and so forth. And then that's often what kicks off the response of lawmaking and things sort of going through the governmental process to potentially be enacted by the government as law, and then leading to case law where there's decisions made based on that legislation that people refer back to as precedent for future cases. So there's notice the importance of ethics. It all starts with that, and arguably different perspectives on that and opportunities for everyone to be involved. There's different methods of influence. I showed this diagram last week as an example of a framework, but just to go into it a bit more, there's different outcomes like awareness, will, and action. And then there's different groups like public influencers and decision makers. So we see litigation in the top right here, but then more like publication and public education down the bottom. And they all seem to sort of help and link to each other in different ways. So there's areas for everyone to get involved. And then a lot of you seem to like the system dynamics diagrams we showed last week. So I wanted to talk briefly about leverage points. So you can think about the state of a system. So I'll give a bathtub as an example. Let's say a bathtub is empty, but I want it to be a warm bath. That's the discrepancy. So my goal, I want it to be a warm bath, but currently it's empty, so there's a discrepancy. So what do? I turn on the tap. So that creates an inflow of water, and I want to make sure it's the right type of inflow, like warm water, which then changes the system and changes the outflows or the impacts. So in that case, it creates a warm bath for me. Or if it's too high of water level, I could let some out. So that might be an abstract example for some, but let's boil it down to you can think about what's the state of the system currently, and then what sort of impacts do you want to make on it to then change the system and how it impacts others. And there's lots more material about system dynamics to learn about. So now let's talk about the law side of things. So what are some of the proposed and existing sources of law? Now, it's kind of difficult to find all this information, so some of the descriptions of current law are a bit out of date. I tried to note that, but this is based on some great information from a University of Cambridge study that I believe was from last year. So the three types of legislation are legislation at the intersection of AI and climate, and then climate change in AI legislation, so AI legislation that mentions climate change, and then AI and climate focused legislation, so climate legislation that mentions AI. A lot of text here. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but I just want to give an overview that here there's this legislation at the intersection of AI and climate, but some of it, for example, the US AI Environmental Impacts Act of 2024, that was introduced as a potential bill, but it never got very far. So there is some stuff that's been introduced or proposed, but may not have made it that far. And then there's climate change in AI legislation, and I'll give an overview at the end of kind of what's where. But different ones that have been proposed or introduced are in Brazil, Chile, Peru, Taiwan, EU, Council of Europe, and so forth. And then finally, AI and climate focused legislation. Let's look at this example of Spain's. So Spain's, which has been said to be like, yeah, one of the only pieces of climate legislation that mentions AI, it creates an obligation for the government to promote digitalization, which would contribute to decarbonization objectives, including the use of AI. And then there's also like different background environmental laws that affect AI development, even if they aren't directly specifically at AI. So, for example, like a water law that might impact data centers. So each of these different ones that I've shown have differing levels of A being introduced or proposed or enforced, and then also regulatory and enforcement practices. They also have different levels of standards or frameworks that they may follow or not, and then they may also be binding or not. And speaking of like sort of this taxonomy, this is a landscape of AI regulation from Stanford and Harvard. It's current at 2024, but I just wanted to show it as like a neat way of breaking down laws based on things like, novelty, maturity, reach, and enforcement. On the Canadian side, that would have reflected Canada's proposed Artificial Intelligence Act, but that unfortunately disappeared. And you can check this out for more detail. I've included the link. And then there's also non-binding recommendations. So UNEP mentioned that around 190 countries have adopted non-binding recommendations on the ethical use of AI, which covers the environment. But non-binding is kind of like when I was a kid, and if my parents were like, you have to eat your dinner in order to have your dessert. But then if I noticed that sometimes they didn't follow through with that, then, of course I wouldn't eat my dinner. I'd just go for the dessert. So. Non-binding, I don't know. It's questionable whether it's more like a guideline from what I understand. And then these non-binding ones also have omissions for sure. And so, what do the existing initiatives actually do? This is based on some research from Climate Change AI. They foster applications, they require transparency, and they regulate data centers. But just to reiterate, this is only in certain geographies and there's omissions and so forth. So, for fostering applications, there's research and development funding and monitoring. There's also climate change as an application area. And then for transparency, it's asking for reporting on energy use of models and requiring environmental impact assessments. And then regulating data centers in the EU, it's asking companies to make available energy data on energy consumption and other things. And interesting, in Germany, it's to inform customers of the energy consumption directly attributable to them. So that's a pretty neat one, I think. So just to summarize, the EU and the United States have introduced, I put introduced in bold because introduced doesn't always mean, it's gone the full way, to temper the environmental impact of AI, but policies like that are few and far between. And there's omissions and gaps. The EU AI Act, which is good law, i.e. it's still in force, it doesn't address energy from inference or emissions from AI applications or water consumption or public transparency. Governments are trying to develop AI strategies at a breakneck speed, but they often don't mention climate. And UNEP has mentioned that the lack of environmental guardrails is no less dangerous than the lack of other AI related safeguards. So, to summarize, there is not much in the way of AI and environment in law, at least in Canada and the US. And if you want to learn more about proposed and existing legislation, there's some organizations trying to organize this information, like OECD's AI Policy Navigator, which tracks public AI policies, the Global AI Law and Policy Tracker, climate policy radar, climate litigation database, climate action tracker. So that's kind of on the AI side of tracking laws, and then on the climate side, and a cool paper, A Need to Regulate the Environmental Impacts of AI. And if you have other info you would like to share about this with me or with the group, totally feel free. So, what sort of legislation is perhaps needed? Well, we know that current legislation is not enough. So, this graphic shows kind of where we're headed in terms of emissions with or without policies. Recall the goal was to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's the 2015 Paris Agreement. But unfortunately, on a 1 year average basis, we're above that already. And if we have no climate policies, we're on track to 4.1 to 4.8 degrees Celsius above, which is extremely hot. With the current policies, we're already above. And this is an amazing graphic, but it was last updated, and I wanted to show it purposely, based on that in 2022, kind of before the massive explosion of AI. So think about how AI might impact this. So this is part of why I think we need much more legislation. And lots of people are asking for it. They're saying to hit pause, at least till we have better rules. They're asking for a moratorium on the development of new data centers. And 230 environmental groups in the US have also asked for that until data centers are regulated. And then there's also grassroots community opposition to AI and data centers popping up, not just from environmental justice communities, but many affluent folks have gone from being NIMBYs, so not in my backyard, to this new term, bananas, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything for various reasons, like environmental and economic reasons. And understandably, they don't want their power rates to rise due to data centers from AI, like the example that I showed before. And so this resistance is part of what's leading to legislative noise and some pressure to have more regulations on things like data centers. Last week, we talked about some of the recommendations I had from my thesis for policymakers, including things like implementing carbon pricing, requiring disclosure of AI use and impact, regulating AI emissions and resources, and then supporting research and development. And so, just to break that down a little further, and hopefully this isn't too dense or small here, but the idea is to not just implement carbon pricing, but also to weave AI related policies into environmental regulations to address the climate impacts. Maybe use a potential carbon price to generate funds to stop the planet from heating. So use that money to help stop climate or reduce climate change. And of course, consider the net climate impact of AI. In terms of requiring disclosure, first we probably need to establish standard procedures for measuring the environmental impact of AI, and then ask companies to disclose the environmental consequences of AI. Right now, a lot of it is very difficult to find. It's not disclosed. And then we should also increase the literacy and awareness of AI's environmental costs so people know. In terms of regulating AI emissions and resource use, we should green the grid. It's currently 80% non-renewable, 20% renewable in the US, for example. If we have more renewable sources like solar and wind, that would decrease the impacts. Also encourage companies to green the data centers, integrate oversight for data center siting across energy, environment, and policy. And then, of course, there's questions to consider, like what if Canada, for example, puts in like quite restrictive laws about data centers? Will then a hyperscaler like Microsoft that might be considering or already putting a data center here just move it to a country with laws that are more amenable? So that's something to think about and how to address that. And then lastly, but possibly could be considered one of the most important, supporting research and development, training, and greening the grid. So looking across those three areas of hardware, software, and infrastructure, making clean by design AI and supporting the build out of that, making algorithms more efficient, and then always trying to do, whenever considering new policies, do ones that reduce consumers' electricity bills rather than increase them, and also enhance AI training and education. And then, of course, we talked about the disproportionate impact of climate on developing countries. So UNFCCC has recommended some actions to unlock the benefits of AI for climate in developing countries, which I just wanted to share. These include investing in infrastructure and capacity building, improving climate data collection and open data, creating regulatory frameworks for transparency, fairness, accountability, and so forth, designing AI systems with inclusive approaches, promoting energy and water efficient AI, and then strengthening cooperation between different groups. And you can click on the link to learn more. There's also some AI governance frameworks, like this risk management framework from NIST, which recommends to map, measure, and manage in order to govern. So think about the different context, risks, and prioritize them, and then use those to govern. They actually put people and planet at the center here of the different life cycle and key dimensions of a AI system that we can take a look at and consider. And if you click into their risk management framework, which I also have in the appendices, it has different recommended actions across each AI lifecycle stage. So for those of you in companies that are thinking about this, for example, you could consider that as a sample process. And AI and climate has been said to potentially be the board's next strategic frontier, with three main priorities: to set the foundations for change, balance and enhance guidance with supervision, and build strategic advantage. But according to my understanding, companies' fiduciary duty, i.e., their legal duty to shareholders, is to maximize profit. So, how can they consider or prioritize climate while benefit corporations or B Corps can consider other objectives such as the environment? But perhaps, I mean, bigger question, but could we change the law to enable more consideration of the climate? So, that's a bit about the legal framework. And lastly, we're going to talk about ethics. First about existing and then potential frameworks. And we'll probably go till around 1:15-ish and then do some socializing and lunch and such. So note, there's so many ethics topics when it comes to AI, and that is beyond the scope of what I could cover today. This is about ethics at the intersection of AI and climate specifically. So, what are some existing ethical frameworks that we can draw from? From Climate Change AI, they mention ethical AI and responsible AI. I'll just read these out. Ethical AI is about moral principles and human rights and ensuring that AI is in line with that. Responsible AI is then about frameworks for implementing these ethical AI principles into the development of a system. There's also climate justice and decolonial AI. So, climate justice is about confronting historical responsibility, colonial legacies, and systemic injustices, whereas decolonial AI is about how AI systems perpetuate colonial power structures. And we'll now look at some specific AI ethics frameworks, and I'll also just see if anything here that I've missed in the chat. Okay, we have some questions that we will answer near the end of this. Okay. And so responsible AI. Responsible AI is this term that you may have heard a lot in the news. And basically, it talks about some considerations when creating AI. There's different ways of breaking them down. Some of the key buckets are transparency and explainability, reliability and safety, fairness, inclusiveness, privacy and security, and then human oversight and accountability. OECD has introduced these AI principles. It's the first intergovernmental standard on AI, and it includes some of the terms I already talked about, as well as inclusive growth, human rights, and then some recommendations, including investing in AI, fostering inclusive AI ecosystems, interoperability between governance and policy environment, human capacity, and then international cooperation for trustworthy AI. So I have a question for you folks, and I'd love for you to use your physical hand for this. Let me get things up so I can see you answer this. Physical, like your actual body hand, both in person and online. I'd love to hear, who do you think will be the guardians of AI's climate impacts? Will it be government, civil society, or business? So let's go hands up for government. Okay, we got a couple people. And feel free to, yeah, you can use your Zoom hand or your physical hand. Hands up for civil society slash NGOs. Okay, so maybe about equal. And then hands up for business. That one looks to be potentially the smallest. Okay, interesting. It was kind of hard to see like exactly the tally there. Maybe someone could put it in the chat if they clocked it better than I did. But yeah, we can see that like it's question mark, right? I don't necessarily have the answer for that. It's kind of going to be up to us. And so I think it's a really interesting question and part of why I wanted to talk about this. And so now that we've talked about the existing AI ethics frameworks, let's talk about some sustainability ethics frameworks. Here from UNESCO, we see the ethical principles of climate change, the prevention of harm, precautionary approach, so taking a precautionary approach with respect to climate, equity and justice, sustainable development, solidarity, so considering, all countries, and then scientific knowledge and integrity in decision making. We also have the sustainable development goals. So we can think about some of those with respect to the intersection of AI and climate, like responsible consumption and production, sustainable cities and communities, and of course, affordable and clean energy and climate action, and look to some of these SDGs for guidance. There's this great framework from MIT Sustainability Initiative of Promise, which looks at what is sustainability. And it says that personal well-being is influenced by relationships, which are influenced by organizations, which are influenced by the market and economy that those organizations sit in, which are influenced by institutions and politics, which are influenced by society and justice, which are then influenced by environment. So, ultimately personal well-being is influenced by environment. And I think, it can also go the other way because, markets and economy and so forth impact the environment. And then finally, there's this shine handprint quantification. We talked a lot about quantifying and the net climate impact last week. This takes into account not just the environmental impact, but also the social and economic impact to look at for a total handprint of something like AI, what are both the internal and external handprints. So internal, i.e., within the scope of the actor's footprint, and external, i.e., with outside the scope of the actor's footprints. And I've been really enjoying some of the work of Joanna Macy, who wrote The Great Turn, or who wrote Active Hope. I'm in a group related to this. And she talks about the three dimensions of the great turning, this societal shift, which may be happening already or could happen more. And those three things are holding actions, so campaigns in defense of life on Earth, life-sustaining systems and practices, so that's about developing new economic and social structures, and then finally shifts in consciousness, so changes in our perception, thinking, and values, so really bringing in the ethical side of things. Now, note that although ethical frameworks are very important, some of the law profs pointed out to me they are soft and lack teeth from a legal liability perspective. So a watch out is hashtag ethics washing, where companies might be talking about their ethical frameworks, but not necessarily following them. And also, if you're finding this a bit esoteric at this point, if you're kind of thinking, I don't know if ethics will solve this, I'm going to contradict myself for a second by highlighting the example of Texas, which some of you may know is like one of the leaders in renewable energy, despite having a different arguably ideology than what might normally be aligned with renewable energy. So if you don't think that ethics are going to help or that we should increase ethics, then perhaps you could consider following the immortal words of the song with the lyrics harder, better, faster, and I would add cheaper, that even if we can't enhance ethics, perhaps we can try and do technological innovation to just make renewable energy and more efficient AI the sort of dominant or the like obvious choice and just move towards that. Because as this article highlights, Texas is demonstrating that an affordable and reliable path to achieving energy resilience, that they're prioritizing practicality over ideology, and perhaps that might be more palatable in today's day and age. But regardless, I do think ethics are still important. So I just want to briefly talk about some ideas for the way forward, and then we'll wrap up. So some guiding questions are the benefits equitably distributed? Is the environmental cost of AI justified by the climate benefit for a given project? Who's making decisions? Who's being consulted? And can we explain how the AI works and then audit its impact? And I have one more sort of poll for you folks, which I'd love to see, is where will the change come from? So we kind of talked about like which organization or who are the guardians of climate impact. This one's a bit different. So I want to know, where do you think the change in reducing AI's climate impacts will come from? Technological innovation, policy/law, finance, or other. So let me just try and get my video thing up again so I can see you folks. Zoom is a thing. Here we go. Okay, so let's go hands up for, oh, you folks can still see my screen, right? Okay, it's paused. Pause now while we're doing the poll. So let's go hands up for where will the change come from? Technological innovation. Oh, great. Now I can see the numbers of hands. Okay, cool. So we have about 23 on here who've said that, and then maybe Zijing can do a count in the room. Okay, now hands up for policy/law. So where will the change come from? Policy/law. 26 people. Okay. So more have said that. Okay. And lastly, where will the change come from? Finance. 11 people or 10 people. Okay, thank you so much for humoring me with that. I'm very curious. Again, I don't necessarily have an answer to this, and it's up to us, but I think it's an interesting quandary to think about. And so I started making, this is, in development and new, but this is my AI and climate systems map, and kind of similar a bit to some of the frameworks like the Promise one we showed before, is kind of a set of layers of things I think influence each other. So we'll start at the top. We have emissions and climate impacts from AI, and those are impacted by system behavior like AI's harms and benefits. That's impacted by implementation of things like, renewable energy, the efficiency of AI. And that's impacted by interventions like policy, technology, innovation, and finance. And then how are interventions impacted? Through mindsets and skills, arguably. So morals, ethics, interpersonal skills, and relationships. Also kind of reminds me of the great work by Otto Scharmer of ULab, who talks about kind of the social soil or social relationships and interpersonal impacting, what we see in terms of how society is shaped. And feel free to check out his work for more information. I can share that. And then how are mindsets and skills influenced? Maybe by leverage points like education, information flows. That's part of why I'm doing this course. So this is one way to look at it, very open to feedback, and there's different ways of looking at it. This is another way to consider it as well as concentric circles. So how can we, whether it's in this map or another one or one you create of your own, find the leverage points, like we talked about in that bathtub diagram, or in the systems change diagram, and then how can we influence the system? And how can we move more towards what I would deem climate responsible AI, where we're not just considering the responsible AI aspects, but also considering sustainability and society, and perhaps those as a key part of it. How do we look for projects where the AI climate benefits exceed the climate harms in that net climate impact of AI equation? And how do we find projects at the intersection of that climate AI framework of AI, business, and climate and societal value? Some tools for ethical decision making are frameworks, a checklist or guiding questions. Some examples could be like a project evaluation tool that maybe your company creates to evaluate projects, stakeholder mapping, life cycle assessment, and then having diverse teams and co-design. And some reflections would be to think about, how can we build or fund AI tools that are both impactful and ethical? What are some paths to engagement that you might want to follow? Research, policy, entrepreneurship. And my call to action for you is to bring an ethics lens into every AI and climate intersection that you encounter. And AI climate ethics is not just for technologists or for philosophers. It's for everyone influencing innovation, finance, and policies. And so I invite you to think about what are your own ethics and how can you influence the ethics of others. And we'll also be talking about that in the homework. And I know some of you are going to be working on ethics as part of your capstones, which is really exciting. And reflecting on this more can perhaps, and taking action in this field can perhaps also help to reduce some eco-anxiety. So to conclude, ethics is not just a checklist you do once. It's a mindset you bring to every stage. You don't have to be an ethicist, you just have to care. And let's build not just powerful projects, but also projects that do good and are fair and responsible. And why ethics is important in this area. I love this quote by Albert Einstein, who was a pretty cool guy. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we create them. So how can we change our thinking and the thinking of others? And there's some resources on how to learn more about the intersection of AI and climate and ethics. I think this is like, I don't know, I'm probably biased, but I think this is like going to be the new and the big topic, and seems to be increasingly so.